Right, so good morning, good day, everyone, and welcome to this session of the CAS SEE guest seminar speakers series. Today with us, we are very glad to host Dr. Christidis, who will speak on the topic of Greek perspectives on the Kosovo crisis and the NATO 1999 intervention in former Yugoslavia. Dr. Christidis is going to also entertain a conversation with led by and facilitated by our fellow Christian Costamagna, who I'd like to briefly introduce here before I leave him the floor and the opportunity to introduce today's topic a little bit more. So Dr. Costamagna earned his PhD in history in 2013 from the University of Eastern Piedmont in Italy, with a dissertation about the political reforms in Serbia and Yugoslavia and the ascent to power of Milosevic during the second half of the 1980s. He holds an MA in International Relations and Human Rights from the University of Turin in Italy. Christian was interning at the Institute for Contemporary History in Belgrade in 2011. While in 2012, he spent a visiting semester at the Faculty of Arts in Ljubljana. Christian has a strong regional focus on the former Yugoslavian region, and he participated in various international conferences, seminars and summer schools, and lectured at a number of universities. In between 2013 and 2016, he has written for journals such as East, Geopolitical Review, Mente Politica, East-West, and European Western Balkans, and the LSE blog about Southeastern Europe. He was an adjunct professor of contemporary history and history of Eastern Europe at the University of Eastern Piedmont from 2014 to 2015. So thank you, Christian, for organizing this session, and I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Valeria, and it is a great pleasure for me to co-host today Professor Christidis. And Professor Christidis is a doctor of philosophy in politics at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom in 1998. And he has a Master of Arts in Middle East Politics at the University of Exeter in 1993, and a Bachelor degree in Politics and International Studies, obtained in 1991. At present, Dr. Christidis is an Associate Professor of Comparative Politics in the Balkans at the Department of Balkan, Slavonic and Oriental Studies of the University of Macedonia, Thessaloniki in Greece. He is also a Research Fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Security Policy, ILIAMEP, in Athens, and a visiting professor at the Faculty of History, University of Sofia, St. Clement Ohridski. And his research interests include political parties and minority issues, foreign policy, and bilateral relations in Southeastern Europe. So today, Professor Christidis will talk about the Greek perspectives on the Kosovo crisis and the 1999 NATO intervention in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So he will explain us how this NATO intervention played a role and how it was understood in Greece at the time. And it will explain also the geopolitical shifts in the region at the time. So I will give you now the floor. Thank you, Professor Christidis.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Costamagna. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited, and thank you very much for the Center of Advanced Studies, University of Rijeka. The discussion today will be concentrated on how Greece and Greek society saw the NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1991 and the Kosovo crisis. But it will have to go beyond that, because you can understand the perspectives that were formed relating to the crisis if you don't go beyond that and you look at how Greek perspectives were formed during the disintegration of Yugoslavia in the 90s. So let me first start with a background information on how Greece saw the end of the geopolitical changes, 1989, 1991, and at what state was Greece, the society and its politics at the same time. The end of bipolarism at the end of 1989, although caused a wave of optimism throughout Europe, in Greek political circles and decision-making circles caused a bit of apprehension. That was mainly the result of the certainties that Greece's position in the NATO alliance mainly had produced post-war in Greece. In other words, Greece's usefulness for West was defined in terms of its alliance in NATO. The beginning of the debates after the end of bipolarism, and especially going through the beginning of the 90s with the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc, of what to do with NATO, caused some apprehension in Greece decision-making circles about what that might potentially have as the consequences for Greece's relations with the West. And that irrespective of the fact that Greece was already part of the European community back then. So one could really detect an apprehension in Greece decision-making circles at the time. So the end of bipolarism was the end of an era of certainties relating the position of Greece in the Western alliance. And there was a question mark. Now, that uncertainty was certainly intensified by developments that took place further north, and I'm referring to Yugoslavia, where I will come back later on. Now, at the same time, when we look back in Greece, 1990, 1991, until 1994, 1995, we can see political polarization. Probably most people recall how Greece went through a debt crisis from 2010 until recently. But as a matter of fact, Greece went another very important crisis in the beginning of the 90s, when its financial situation was very dire. And there was concern that the country could actually derail. So the new government that was formed following the elections back in April 1990 was forced to implement policies of austerity that caused very strong reactions from the labor unions. So we had a period of labor unrest, and we had a period of political polarization between the parties in parliament because of the austerity policies. Another important detail at the time was that the government that was formed after the elections of April 1990 was a conservative government, had a very slim majority, 1 MP in parliament. It was a parliamentary majority of 151 MPs. To remind you, the Greek parliament has 300 MPs. So we have a very slim majority in parliament, and a government which is attempting to deal with a challenging economic situation in Greece, opposition from labor unions, and at the same time has to deal with those geopolitical changes that take place in Europe at the time. Now, this is the setting. Now, this is a photo of Mr. Samaras. He was a young foreign minister who actually became associated with some very important decisions on the so-called Macedonian question. And on my right-hand side, is Mr. Mitsotakis. He's the father of the current prime minister. He was also, he became prime minister in April 1990. Now, the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Give you, first of all, a bit of background on relations between Greece and Yugoslavia. Relations between Greece and Yugoslavia, although most people tend to concentrate on relations between Athens and Belgrade in the 90s, actually those relations historically in the 20th century were not free of problems and tensions. When Yugoslavia was formed post First World War, Yugoslavia emerged as the stronger state north of Greece, and there was always an apprehension in the mid-war period in the 20s and 30s in Greece concerning Yugoslavian tensions on issues like, for example, minorities. But nevertheless, in the 20s and 30s, the real concern for Greece was the revisionism coming from Sofia, from Bulgaria. Post Second World War, relations with Yugoslavia were terrible because Greece went through a civil war, and during the time, the main supporter of the Greek left in the civil war became Belgrade. Now, the real problem for Athens was that Belgrade was providing support to the Greek left in the civil war, not only because of ideological solidarity for a communist movement, but because Athens strongly believed Belgrade had an agenda relating to the Macedonian question, i.e., following the recognition of a Macedonian people and of a Macedonian republic, Arona Republika Macedonia, in Yugoslavia, Athens was concerned that Belgrade was supporting the Greek left because it was looking forward to a possible victory of the Greek left that would allow even territorial changes between Greece and Yugoslavia with, for example, the formation of autonomous Macedonian units inside northern Greece that would potentially secede to Yugoslavia and join the Arona Republika Macedonia in Yugoslavia. Now, that was the concern of the Greek conservative government at the time, but it illustrates how really problematic were the relations. And it's not a coincidence that diplomatic relations between Greece and Yugoslavia actually were re-established in 1952, 7 years following the end of the Second World War. And actually, that normalization diplomatic of relation took place because there was pressure from London and Washington on Athens to support Yugoslavia following its rift with Moscow in 1948. So in the beginning of the 50s, the first half of the 50s, we have a number of regional developments that are very interesting. Greece, Turkey, together with Yugoslavia, form a kind of regional union, a defensive union that are actually very soon after 1956 became basically non-operative. But what I'm trying to say is that the normalization of relations between Greece and Yugoslavia in the 50s takes place not because Athens has really let's say, feels comfortable with the Macedonian policy of Yugoslavia, but feels obliged to do that because of its, let's say, dependency upon Britain and especially the United States in its foreign policy at the time. Relations with Yugoslavia, although never deteriorate after 1952, nevertheless, for Athens are a bit uneasy because of the Macedonian policy of Yugoslavia. Now, in the 60s and later on, there will be criticism coming from Belgrade for the negation of Macedonian minority in Greece and the suppression of its rights. Now, post-1974, although Athens took the strategic decision that it had really to have good relations with all its northern neighbors because following Turkey's invasion of Cyprus in 1974, the major threat for Greek security was coming from this. So it had to have good relations with its northern communist neighbors. Nevertheless, there was always an unease in Athens concerning the Yugoslav position on the Macedonian question. That was always on the background. So in the 70s, in the 80s, we see relations always are underlined from Athens' point of view, the Greek-Yugoslav relations as being very good, but there is unease. You can feel that because Belgrade never ceased, never stopped from time to time, occasionally, and increasingly in the 80s, to raise the question of the rights of a Macedonian minority, which was not recognized in Greece. So this is the situation as far as the background of relations is concerned. And during that time, we can hardly talk of any Greek-Serbian special relationship. It's absent. Greece and Serbia became allies in the context of the common opposition of the Ottoman Empire. They fought together in the First Balkan War, and they fought together in the Second Balkan War. And also, in the First World War, the remnants of the Serbian army that found their way to the Adriatic through Corfu, they ended up in Salonika, in the so-called Macedonian front. Now, these were positive historical memories, but you couldn't say that these formed really a special relationship in the minds of the Greek public, not at all. So in 1990, it's very interesting, relations between Greece and Yugoslavia are very tense because we have, again, statements by the minister of the federal government in Belgrade concerning the rights of the Macedonian minority in Greece. And also, we have, back at the time, 1990, we have protests by Macedonian citizens at the border between Yugoslavia and Greece, who are actually closing the border, crossing with Greece, protesting against the negation of the rights of the Macedonian minority in Greece. So actually, in 1990, the atmosphere is really bad between Athens and Belgrade, between Greece and Yugoslavia. But what happens? The crisis of Yugoslavia deepens following the multi-ethnic elections in Yugoslavia, the emergence of new political forces with agendas, etc., etc. You know those things better than me. The debates about, changing Yugoslavia to a confederation and other issues that come to the fore. Now, the deepening of the crisis in Yugoslavia brought to the fore at the beginning of 1991 the real prospect of a disintegration of Yugoslav state. Now, for Athens, that was a particularly negative development for two main reasons. The first one was, of course, the Macedonian question, because any disintegration of Yugoslavia, by definition, would probably allow for the emergence of an independent Republika Macedonia, and that Athens was very much against. And secondly, because at the time, the beginning of 1991, most of the Greek trade with the rest of the European community was conducted by road through Yugoslavia. So Athens wouldn't like to see any disruption of the main, we could say, trade route of Greece with the rest of the European community. So this is the main position of Athens vis-a-vis what is happening in Yugoslavia. And that brings about the emergence of close contacts between the Greek government and the Serbian government, Milosevic. This is how it takes place in 1991. And it's not, for example, accidental that Athens, if I'm not mistaken, is trying at the time to initiate a trilateral meeting between Milosevic, the Bulgarian Prime Minister at the time, if I can recall his name, his surname was Popov, and Mitsotakis, to discuss developments in Yugoslavia, but everyone realizes to discuss what the three, let's say, capitals should do vis-a-vis Republika Macedonia. That initiative, however, never materialized because Sofia never took part. So the concerns of Athens vis-a-vis Macedonia, the Republica Macedonia at the time, or North Macedonia today, bring closer Athens, Greek government, and the Serbian government. Okay. June 1991, we have the declarations of independence by Croatia and Slovenia. It's very interesting when one tries to understand how perceptions on what is happening in Yugoslavia, in Greece are taking place. One can detect, it's very clear that there is a narrative that tries to pin blame mainly on external powers, on what has been happening in Yugoslavia, disregarding totally dimensions of developments like, the right of self-determination of Croatians and Slovenes. It's very interesting, the time. And this is something that is really gaining ground inside Athens, that machinations by external powers, and Germany in particular, are to be blamed for the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Why Germany? Following its reunification, there is a feeling or a fear that reunited Germany might flex its diplomatic and economic muscles and seek to create an area of influence in countries that had historically good relations with Croatia and Slovenia, etc., etc. So this is a narrative that gains ground, and it completely disregards the internal factor, the internal developments. Completely disregards, might sound, irrational, but it's true. There is regards that, the decision taken by Croats and Slovenes to leave the federation, and why did they do that? Now, at this point, I have to really underline some of the important ideological traits that relate to the discussion we have in Greece. Now, Greece, in its historical development, of course, as every other state, is very specific. There are certain historical events that have lived, their mark on how the national narrative has been formed. What is interesting is that, historically speaking, we are talking about a state that was formed and remained in a Western sphere of influence. 19th century, Britain is the patron state of Greece, not in a religious sense of the word, but in a international relations sense of the word. It's a patron state for Greece. And Britain really allows Greece to expand territorially in a certain way. Decisions were favorable for Greece, but nevertheless, following the Minor Asia debacle, to understand what is that, is the defeat of the Greek attempt after 1920 to materialize the so-called megali idea, the big idea in Greek foreign policy since the 19th century, which more or less sought to gain the territory where ethnic Greeks were living in Minor Asia. Okay, we have the defeat of the Greek army in 1922. In 1923, we have the Lausanne Treaty that signifies the end of any kind of ideas about that. That created a big national trauma in Greek society. At the same time, gave birth to ideas that why this happened. There was a feeling, of betrayal, of leaving us alone in Minor Asia. That ideas that actually created that idea of being a brotherless people and an underdog. Okay, that gained dominance in Greek society. And the 20s and the 30s in Greece, anyway, are very difficult times, economically, politically, etc., etc. Another important trait that is relative to the debate is the anti-Americanism and the anti-Westernism that became a major trait in Greek political culture, of course, with the American intervention in the Greek Civil War on the side of the conservative forces. the role that Washington is seen as having played in Greek politics in the 50s and 60s, and in the in the intervention by military officers in 1967. So anti-Americanism became a major trait of the political culture in Greece, especially among Greeks. However, the Cyprus event in 1974, again, and the understanding of the Turkish invasion as having been allowed by the Americans somehow, intensified that anti-Americanism and even spread anti-Americanism among the Greek right. So anti-Americanism in the 1990s is a very widespread trait of Greek political culture that can be found not only in the Greek left, but also in the Greek right. And that played a role in the perceptions about what was happening in Yugoslavia at the beginning of the 90s. The idea that somehow Yugoslavia was falling apart because imperialist forces had machinated against its existence. And in that context, the Serbs were seen as an underdog, fighting against imperialist designs in Yugoslavia. And that made them somehow, as an object of, let's say, of sympathy in a country and a society that had very important traits, ideological traits of thinking like that, in terms of an underdog, of a brotherless people, etc., etc. Although you can say that the Serbs are brotherless people, as part of a big Slavic community. Right. So the notion of a traditional Greek-Serbian friendship is basically a byproduct and a development post-1990, is a byproduct of other foreign policy concerns and ideological currents in Greece at the time. Does not relate in itself with some historical facts of traditional bonds between Greeks and Serbs, because those bonds do not exist. Okay, both Greeks and Serbs are Orthodox, and okay, they never fought against each other, but that does not constitute special bond of friendship. Okay, and let's not forget, because everyone who lives in the Balkans is very much aware that we in the Balkans, the people, suffer from that familiarity of discontent. We don't like anyone who is like us. And most of the Balkan people have many commonalities. So we tend to don't like each other. That's, I think, everyone who lives in the Balkans can understand that. So we can talk in terms of a historical relationship, close relationship between Greece and Serbia. This is a byproduct of other ideological currents and foreign policy concerns of the 90s. What brought together Athens and Belgrade, in my understanding, in the 90s was concern on the case of Athens about the emergence of an independent Republika Macedonia at the time and how that could be contained, because as a matter of fact, the contacts between Athens and Belgrade, between the Greek government and Milosevic that had been initiated in 1991, continued in 1992. The Greek government had channels of communication with Belgrade, and probably Belgrade was cultivating an illusion on the side of Greece that maybe it could persuade Skopje to remain in a small Yugoslav federation. I'm talking about the end of 1991, beginning of 1992, okay, to be specific, because you probably are aware, Republika Macedonia held its referendum in September 1991, but the steps to actually materialize that independence were very slow and very careful on the part of Skopje. For example, the new currency was introduced in the spring of 1991. The army in the Republic of Macedonia, national defense, was introduced in the first half of 1992, excuse me, and the currency in 1992. So we are talking about a few months of very careful if I can say, decisions on the part of the Skopje government and its president, who played a very important role at the time, Kiro Gligorov. So this is it's a time period of a few months, maybe 6-7 months, that Belgrade is actually cultivating that illusion on Athens that it could potentially influence Skopje on joining a smaller Yugoslav federation together with Montenegro. Okay. And that played a role, brought together Athens and Belgrade, and also had an effect on the perception of the Greek media on what was going on in Yugoslavia. Okay. Although I was not in Greece at the time, at the second half of 1991, but from what I was reading, from the newspapers they would send me, I was studying in UK at the time, so I would receive newspapers sent to me by my family. The violence that erupted in the Croatian front lines, the horrors of Vukovar, for example, never became very clear in Greece, in the Greek public. What happened in Vukovar? All that violence, who was responsible, etc., etc. You can see early on with the hostilities in Yugoslavia that Greek media do not play a very objective role in how they portray developments in Yugoslavia. And that played a role in the perceptions of the Greek public. Okay. So what we see is that the Serbia is portrayed, as an underdog, as defending themselves, with developments have taken place as also the result of involvement by external powers, Germany, etc., etc. And with the eruption of war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, April 1992, and all the violence that took place, in Greek public perceptions, we have that idea that Serbia is actually fighting somehow a cause common with Greece against the spread of Turkish influence in the Balkans. Now, I have to clarify here that fear, a very important fear that emerged in the beginning of the 90s with the dissolution of Yugoslavia, was that Turkey, with which Greece had all the difficulties and the problems, could take advantage of the new geopolitical opportunities to spread its influence. For example, in the discourse of the Greek media at the time, you find the term Islamic axis in the Balkans, the emerging Islamic axis in the Balkans. What that meant was that Turkey would be at the center of an alliance of, let's say, entities, Muslim in character, but not necessarily only Muslim, that would ally with Turkey. And that entities could include an independent Bosnia, Kosovo, potentially Albania, Republika Macedonia, although it's a multi-religious country. Nevertheless, you see that major fear, and that fear also played a role in actually facilitating that spread of the idea that together with the Serbs, we're on the same side. We are fighting actually the same threats in the Balkans. And give an example of to the extent of how public opinion switched in favor of Serbia at the time. Karadzic, who 1993 was vilified in the West as being responsible for crimes, very serious crimes, was nevertheless invited by the Greek church, the Autokephalos Church of Greece, in Athens in June 1993. He was received and he was seen by clerics and very prominent politicians. And it's very interesting, although Karadzic, the same year, had rejected the Vance-Owens plan, which Athens had not only supported, but made an effort in May 1993, organized a meeting in Athens, a gathering of all the main parts of the conflict concerned, together with the European Union, etc., to make Karadzic accept the plan. And Karadzic initially in Athens said yes, and then he said, okay, this is a conditional yes, but I have to go to the Assembly of the Bosnian Serbs and get their support. But when he went back to Pale, where the Bosnian Serb Assembly was, the plan was rejected. And by the way, a very interesting detail, among the very few Bosnian Serb MPs who voted in favor of the Vance-Owens plans is Dodic, the present president of Republika Serbia. It's a very interesting detail that. Nevertheless, Karadzic actually never stick to his promise to actually try and pass the Vance-Owens plans, and that was really not good for Greek diplomacy. But nevertheless, Karadzic is invited in Athens, and he's seen by high-ranking clerics and politicians. And he says the following, I don't know if you can see it. Everybody is telling us to lay down our arms because we're alone. We say, no, we're not alone. We have with us God and the Greeks. And this is very interesting because it shows how Karadzic, as another, Serbian politician, was playing with those ideas with the Greek public, cultivating the idea of a special bond at the time. Okay. And I must say here that it did have importance for the Bosnian Serbs to cultivate that idea, because during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, huge amounts of humanitarian assistance were sent from all over Greece to Serbia and to the Bosnian Serbs. There was a huge mobilization by associations of friendship and others, professional associations, to send humanitarian assistance mainly to Serbs at the time. And this is a photo of the visit of Karadzic, as you can see, with a cleric, and the man with the white hair is a former defense minister. It's called Tsohadzopoulos. He was actually imprisoned for a major scandal. He died a few years ago. Right. Now, let's stay for a while on Greek ethnic nationalism, okay, which is the dominant ideology. And those ideological traits we discuss, we have to see them as part of, of the dominant ideology of Greek ethnic nationalism. Now, in the beginning of the 90s, and that actually facilitated all those perceptions and all those feelings of solidarity with Serbia, we have a rise of Greek nationalism. And the question of Macedonia became the point that actually allowed for that, let's say, eruption of nationalism in Greece at the time. Why? The Macedonian question at the beginning of the 90s actually mobilized Greek society in a specific direction. The emergence of an independent Republika Macedonia was seen as a threat to Greek national identity and as an usurpation of Greek historical heritage and identity relating to Greek Macedonia. This was the dominant perception of what really an emergent Republika Macedonia concerned. Now, however, when one looks closer on, how Greek society perceived the question of independent Republika Macedonia at the time, could see major ideological traits. Republika Macedonia was seen as a threat, irrespective of, it wasn't able to threaten Greece in any meaningful way, militarily or otherwise, but it was seen mainly as a cultural threat, and as a threat to the Greek identity. We had a total rejection of the other. And equally important, the atmosphere in Greece at the beginning of the 90s became so much polarized and so much irrational. And we see the same thing on how they viewed developments in the rest of Yugoslavia, how they viewed the war in Bosnia, for example. There was a lack of any kind of tolerance for a different point of view. There was a rejection of any criticism. Now, the debate on the Macedonian issue in Greece in the 90s has many similarities on how Greece, the society, saw at large developments in the rest of Yugoslavia. Very much nationalistic. They were much concentrated on the concept of threat, on the rejection of the other. Okay, so those two, I think, issues go hand in hand. How Greek society viewed the wars in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina with how Greek society viewed the independence of Republika Macedonia, North Macedonia at the time. Okay. Now I'll give you a few photos. This is from a demonstration, probably the largest demonstration that ever took place in Greece. It's in 1992, as you can see, thousands of people gathered in Thessaloniki. This is a photo of Thessaloniki. As you can see, huge gathering. Greece has never seen any kind of other demonstration at the time. Okay. This, I think, portrays well, you know, the polarization that the Macedonian question caused at the time and the kind of feelings, nationalist feelings that brought in the surface. And this is very interesting. These are some of the speakers of the meeting, and there are symbols of Greek nationalism. We have, you know, the church. We have on my left-hand side someone who represents the so-called Makedonomachus, people who fought for Greece in the Ottoman Macedonia, and in the middle is the mayor of Thessaloniki at the time. And on the back, you can see the flags. Okay, this is very, I think, seminal. The semantics, I think, talk very much about the meeting. Now, let's move on the Kosovo crisis and NATO's intervention. I think I'm okay with the time. I think I passed the 45 minutes, but I will continue. Okay, very briefly. What were the main elements of public perception? Okay, we saw the background of the 90s, moving on in 1999. Now, the main ideas were the Kosovo Albanians were separatists. Serbs were defending the territorial integrity of the state. The Kosovo Albanians were fleeing Kosovo not because of Serbian brutality, but because of NATO bombs. NATO's military intervention was illegal because it was lacking a Security Council resolution, and NATO was waging an imperialist war and not a humanitarian intervention. Okay, these were the main elements, I think, of the public perception of the time. Again, what we saw was that Greek society mobilized even more on the side of Serbia, and mobilized even more against condemning the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia. Mikis Theodorakis, who was a symbol of Greek culture and of progressive Greek thinking, a major composer and a major figure in the Greek left. He organized a solidarity concert in Athens for the victims of NATO intervention. He castigated the United States and its European allies for applying the law of the strong and making Yugoslavia as an example for all those that dare to oppose the West. And he actually stated the Greeks could be proud of the fact that they were the only ones who rebelled against this barbarism and stood by the Serbs, whereas the majority of Europeans were blind and deaf. Yeah, this is very illustrative, I think, of the dominant perception of what happened in 1999 in Kosovo and Yugoslavia. That there was an illegal war, that the Serbs were defending their territory, that the Albanians were separatists. Again, one could see at the same time that important aspects, even more important aspects of the crisis were totally disregarded, with few exceptions in the 90s. Few academics who had actually conducted research had been to Kosovo. There was a total disregard about the situation that was prevalent in Kosovo in the 90s, the apartheid that the Serbian regime had organized against the Kosovo Albanians. That was missing from the discussions in the Greek media. So when the NATO intervention took place, there was condemnation among all political parties. The Greek government was in a very difficult position. It did not veto any of the decisions of the NATO alliance, but it made it clear it would never participate in any raids against Serbia, in any military attacks. And there were demonstrations all the time against condemning the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia. Okay, as you can see, there was an overwhelming one-sided media coverage of the conflict. There was an almost total absence of any criticism against the Milosevic regime policies, and that despite a growing body of Greek academics who were critical of those policies. And what is again interesting is that we have another issue that affects those perceptions that does not have to do with what was happening in Kosovo itself, but has to do with, let's say, an issue for Greece. The fear was that any secession of Kosovo could serve potentially as a precedent for a very sensitive issue in Greece, which is the Muslim minority in Western Thrace. And I need another lecture to explain to you about that issue. But this actually was a factor that affected discussions, certainly among decision makers, and certainly in the media about how Greece should stand vis-a-vis what was happening in Kosovo. Now, another interesting observation is that, especially among not only the Greek left, but also the Greek right, especially those people who shared that anti-Americanism, the intervention in Yugoslavia was seen as another example of American objection to establish the New World Order. The New World Order, as you can see, became a catchphrase. At the time, those very fears of an imperialist Western advance into the Balkans that sought to destroy the region's identity. Okay, so it signified all those fears of a Western imperialist attempt to destroy the cultural identity of the region. Now, I will close with that. Since, of course, 1999, we have a growing body of even journalists and politicians, together, of course, with academics that have been questioning of the policies of the beginning of the 90s and of the prevalent public perceptions and narratives at the time. And that really has been assisted by a shift in Greek foreign policy post-1990 vis-a-vis Belgrade, because after the NATO intervention, but even before that, but after the NATO intervention, Athens distanced itself from Milosevic, and actually in 2000, Athens tried to bring together the Serbian opposition in forming, a bloc against Milosevic, and that caused problems in the relations with Belgrade. Now, criticism has been diffusing down to society. However, we can still see stereotypes that are very hard to change in Greek society. So the idea that there are special bonds between Greeks and Serbs is very much present still together at the level of society. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you. And I should mention that source, Christian has also sent me that source. It's by Fotiadis. I think everyone who wants to see more detail, those ideological issues that played a role in the formation of Greek perceptions concerning Greek-Serbian friendship could see that article by Fotiadis, United Against the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. It's an open access article at the internet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Christidis, for your very interesting presentation about the Greek perceptions of the Yugoslav crisis and the NATO intervention against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It is a great time to collect some questions for you. And so I will maybe give the floor to those who want and wish to ask some questions. Yeah, is there someone? Not,
so a few hands, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Nicola,
Sanya,
Valeria, yes.
And Valeria, okay.
Thank you very much. It has been a while since the end of the 20th century. What happened in between, and how other geopolitical changes shifted? You certainly followed what has been happening, and you certainly have as an expert, a view on what are the perspectives of what is going to be next, not only in the Balkans or the strict triangle. So I will introduce Bulgaria, triangle, Serbia, Macedonia, Bulgaria, and it's not anymore triangle, Greece. But compared to the Greek economic crisis that influenced relationship towards Europe and the world. And so what is going there and what is happening now relative to the Ukraine-Russian war? Thank you.
Christian, shall I answer or shall I pick up other questions?
Yeah, as you prefer. I mean, if you want to answer immediately, I think it could be fine.
Okay, let's hear the other questions. I will write them down and we'll. Okay.
Okay, so Valeria, I think that you had also you raised your hand before.
Yeah, it was also clapping, but it doubles as a question sign. So thank you, Professor Christidis. It was a really thorough, very informative piece of history that I myself am not super familiar with, and it really does bring certain elements of recent history into perspective for me. So thank you. My question is very much an open one, but I would be interested to hear more, perhaps your take on the religious component of this cultural, in this mix of different cultural identities and anti-Americanism and these apocalypse tones that were invoked. So not only the two main Orthodox churches that we can think about, but I was very interested by this Muslim minority in trans that I'm really not familiar with this issue at all. So this seems also, so any further information around this religious angle and how, if you think that was weighting significantly or if it was more of a sign concern overall considered, maybe trade and other concerns were more prominent. Thanks.
Thank you, Valeria. Is there some other participant who would like to pose a question to Professor Christidis?
I'm happy to ask a very general question. I was my reaction was like clapping hands, but I'm also happy to intervene. Thank you very much for the talk. That was very interesting, and especially for me as a not a specialist of this area and of this history. But I was very intrigued when you described a bit the intellectual or let's say background of some Greek left political groups. And I remember, for example, that I happened to I mean, I lived in Germany when the big economic crisis and the big happened, and there was this like huge discussion about the destiny of like Greece and so I was wondering now what happened in that time exactly with the other countries involved. What was the role of the geopolitical like scenario in that context, let's say? That's a very general question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Difficult questions, very challenging, very complex topics, all of them. Okay, begin with what Valeria asked, about the religious component, and with a reference on the Muslim minority. Now, the religious component, of course, is very important in the Greek case because the modern Greek identity has been defined as part of an Orthodox religious character. And as a matter of fact, when you see the development of the Greek state, since its establishment, the modern Greek state, the church is a very central institution in Greece. It has been working in close collaboration with the state until today. So religion is a very important element, both of identity, but also, we could say, in actual politics in Greece, and remains until today. So Greek clerics can have an influence on issues of Greek foreign policy, and this has been the case in the past as well. The most notable example, of course, the Cyprus question, when we had a cleric, a high cleric, Makarios, who actually raised the issue at the end of the 40s in British Cyprus of Cyprus uniting with Greece. And he actually visited Greece at the time, and he tried to force the Greek government, beginning of the 50s, after the end of the Civil War, to mobilize diplomatically. And the answer by the then Greek Prime Minister, who was an ex-military officer, was that we breathe with two lungs. One is a British lung. Do you want us to die of suffocation? But you can see the role that clerics actually play in Greek politics. The church has the power to mobilize the masses in Greece, has repeatedly proven that. In 2000, the Greek government was in open confrontation with the institution of the church. Why? Because it tried to change the identity cards. It had decided that there should be no reference to your religion in your identity cards because it was seen as out of date, and the church openly contested that decision. And there was actually a confrontation with the government. The church lost, but it mobilized the people. So the church in Greece is very strong. Spiritually, has a lot of hold in Greek society, and institutionally also has a political influence. And no one can ignore the role that the church plays in Greece, Valeria. And that also concerns, okay, the way they perceived developments in Yugoslavia. We saw that photo with, the cleric and Karadzic sitting next to each other. It talks on itself. Okay. Now, the Muslim minority is a term used based on the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923. This is the treaty that actually settled issues after the end of the Greek-Turkish War of 1922. Okay. And the Treaty of Lausanne has clauses relating to minority issues. For the Western Thrace, which is a region in northwestern Greece, it referred to a Muslim minority. Greece, until today, when it talks about the Muslim population of that region, uses the term Muslim minority. It's a very sensitive issue because it has become part of a very sensitive bilateral issues with Ankara, especially post-1955, when post-1955 we have a steep deterioration of Greek-Turkish relations, and you cannot understand Greek policies vis-a-vis the Muslim minority in Western Thrace if you don't take into account the wider context of Greek-Turkish relations. Now, generally speaking, it's a very sensitive topic because it's a border region with Turkey, and it's seen from a security perspective. So minority issues in Greece have been seen through a security perspective, not through a human rights perspective. That's a very recent development, if I can put it that way. And that also concerns the Western Thrace. The position of the minority and other issues officially have been looked at through a security perspective. And it's not by accident that the ministry in Greece traditionally that had been responsible for minority issues in Greece, it's not the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yes. Very interesting, isn't it? Okay. Now, Nicola, on the intellectual background relating to the crisis in 2010s. Right? And if I understood you correctly, how the Greek public saw the crisis and the responsible.
Yes, but also what happens after that crisis in the among also with the other countries you have been talking about.
Yeah, well, okay, the 2010s are a very interesting time and traumatic time for Greek society. Why? Because the debt crisis became a multidimensional crisis. Debt crisis became a financial crisis, became a social crisis, became a political crisis. The dominant political setup in Greece changed. Greece had a multi-party system from 1974 until 2012. Changed. The two main parties that dominated Greek politics, one of those parties almost disappeared, the Greek Socialist Party, as a result of the crisis. It was very traumatic. It brought to the fore a wave of discontent with the political system. It also played to the hands of especially populist forces everywhere in the left and the right. So it was not by accident that we saw in the 2010s the emergence of that right wing. It was a neo-Nazi party, the Golden Dawn in Greece, that actually gained around 6% of the vote in the Greek parliament. And it was clearly it was a party that alluded to principles of Nazism. Okay, but it gained an important presence in Greek parliament. So we have a discontent sweeping through the Greek society and has political consequences. And also during the time, again, those ideological undercurrents of the underdog of imperialists taking advantage of Greece, we saw earlier on, came into the surface. Germany was portrayed as being, the prime responsible for the crisis, that the Greeks had to pay a price for saving the German banks and the French banks through the austerity. That was a narrative that gained enormous influence in Greek society. it strengthened that tendency used by populists not have an open and, an honest debate about how we reach the point of the crisis. What is our own responsibility? Use scapegoats. And to a certain extent, there was a tendency really to blame others, especially, Germany inside the European Union for the austerity policies that Greece was forced to implement. Now, of course, as the economic situation is being normalized, of course, those feelings have withdrawn, those emotions. Certainly, you won't find, that, let's say, anti-German rhetoric so dominant the time anymore in the Greek media. It has withdrawn, it has receded in the background. Things have to a certain extent normalized because the economy has to a certain extent normalized, and this is clear. I think this is one of the lessons of why populists gain ground, why right-wing parties gain ground. You have a severe economic crisis. This is the best way for those people to come to power. This is clear in the Greek case. But I think on the positive side, I think it must be said, the fact that Greek democracy withstood the pressures of all that discontent is very important, because the 2010s were the most serious test for the Greek parliamentary democracy established post-1974, and it withstood the test with success. And this is, I think, the positive that comes from that story. Okay, Sanya, could you please repeat the question, please?
I was, I was curious, and it's a question of your expertise. I was curious to find out what has been happening by the end of 20th century. We had it, and you described it so well. But what is going on now? And what is going on now compared to, or in the context of the new violences and new wars that we are having in Europe? Because Europe, during the glorious 60s, the second part of the 20th century, was proud of not having wars on its territory, and then it started with the Yugoslav wars, and then it's going on. Thank you.
Okay, I will begin from where I left it, the beginning of the 2000s, because I think it's very important. Now, at the time, the Greek government of the time, led by a reformist-led prime minister and a group of advisors and ministers who were also reformists, realized that actually Greece had to make important steps in the direction of reforms and also in the direction of foreign policy. So they distanced themselves from Milosevic. At the same time, they managed to gain access to the euro. They energetically work in the direction of taking advantage of the opportunities provided by the European Union. And also in the case of the Western Balkans, they became much more active in the direction of supporting the EU prospect for the Western Balkans. The Thessaloniki Summit Declaration, I think, is the most notable example of that. But at the same time, because Greece became, let's say, somehow engulfed into that enthusiasm of organizing the Olympic Games, it went through a period of relative economic prosperity post-2000. It gained the euro 2004. The society never really thought carefully what had happened in the 90s. We never really went through a self-criticism. All those things went to the background because other things came to the fore. You know, there was a sense of enthusiasm, euphoria, organizing the Olympic Games, the economy was working well, we entered the euro, etc., etc., etc. But the changes were taking place, and this is very important. And these were positive changes. Now, 2010, the crisis, of course, as we said, was very important in many respects, but it not actually challenged effectively the position of Greece in, let's say, in the European Union. It could have had, it's true, or in NATO. And what it's very interesting, 2015, we have a new left-wing party that came into power. And actually that party went ahead and signed the Prespa agreement, which in the terms of Greek foreign policy in the Western Balkans is very important because it signified the normalization, the second stage, we could say, of the normalization of relations with North Macedonia. The first stage, it was back in 1995, with the solution of the so-called name dispute. And that wasn't very easy because, again, the clauses of the agreement regarding Macedonian identity and language of the Prespa agreement were very controversial for large parts of the Greek society, especially here in northern Greece. But nevertheless, the government had the courage to go through with the agreement. And that was a very important step, really, of, let's say, of normalizing Greek foreign policy. And also it shows us, it's very important, it shows us that big changes in foreign policy can take place, but they need political elites that must go against the current, but they can materialize. So we have that important step that actually closes an important problem for Greek foreign policy, and normalizes its relation with North Macedonia. And post 2019, we have a new Greek government, right-wing government, that gives a lot of emphasis in strengthening relations with Washington and on building on various schemes of cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean, because at the same time, relations with Turkey deteriorate. From 2019, relations deteriorate. So when the Ukrainian crisis or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, more accurately, takes place, beginning last year, what is Greece? It has a very solid relations with Washington. It has very good relations now with major EU partners, very good relations. And actually, from day one, Athens, really agrees with its Western partners on the understanding of what the crisis means, who is the responsible part, and what should be done. Okay, mobilize, support Ukraine in every possible way, condemn the Russian invasion, and also its consequences. For example, what does it mean for the geopolitical importance of the Western Balkans? How the Western Balkans should advance on the road to EU accession. Athens has been, a steady supporter of Western Balkan accession. This has been clear to the Greek government. So the Ukrainian crisis has actually, I think, made clear those unequivocal ties that Athens has with the West. This has been the dominant, actually, principle of the Greek ruling elite since the end of the Civil War. Greece is part of the West. Okay, this has been the case, etc., etc. Of course, the concern is, and I will finish with that, Sanya, that Russian revisionism, Russian aggression is giving providing a wrong example to Erdogan, is encouraging Erdogan to potentially, adventurous moves against Greece. This is a major fear here, that Russian revisionism and expansionism has to be defeated in Ukraine, because if it isn't defeated in Ukraine, it will give, it will pass the wrong message to Turkey that might, be attempted to challenge the status quo militarily in the Aegean. So this has been a major concern in Athens.
Thank you. I would like to ask Valeria if there is still time for one question.
Absolutely, Christian. We would love to hear from you and your responses and reflections on everything that was discussed as a great way to wrap up for today. Please.
Yes, well, I think that all of us discovered with this presentation of Professor Christidis a lot of insight from the Greeks' perspective and how it was, how the Yugoslav crisis impacted on Greece, and somehow vice versa. Because some issues that were raised today, for example, a close connection by the end of the 90s between the extreme left and extreme right in supporting somehow Serbian nationalism, were present also in Italy. It was possible to find a similar phenomenon, and we can say that it was not just Greece and Italy, but also in other countries. There's that contamination, ideological contamination somehow between those two extremes of the political spectrum. They joined somehow, and but I would love to ask many questions to Professor Christidis, but I have to cut them down to a very small number. Let's two. The first one is: do you think that one of the reasons that were used by President Bill Clinton in March '99 to start the NATO operation against Yugoslavia was the fact that it was possible, because of the conflict in Kosovo, an expansion of the conflict in the region of the Balkans, and with that sparkle from Kosovo, maybe through Macedonia, and then Greece, and then Turkey, and so a war, a new third Balkan war was envisioned as a possibility. So the NATO intervention was a preemptive military action to avoid in the next future a conflict. So the first question is it possible, in your opinion, that at the time in 1999 there could be some sort of conflict between Greece and Turkey? And the second question, very short, do you think that in the future Athens, Greece, will recognize Kosovo as a sovereign country and as a republic? Thank you very much.
Okay, Christian, I lost the first part of your comments because I lost the connection, but I heard the questions.
Yeah.
Okay, now, when Clinton went public and said that there's a fear of a regional confrontation because of Kosovo, I think he was also aware of a very steep deterioration of relations between Athens and Ankara because of the Kurdish issue. This is the time when Öcalan, the head of the PKK, was apprehended in Nairobi, leaving the house of the Greek ambassador, because Greece was actually involved in an effort to find a safe refuge of Öcalan in Africa. Now, Öcalan for Turkey was threat number one, security problem number one, because for the younger in the audience, to remind that the PKK issue is security problem number one in Turkey in the 90s, because Turkey is involved in a war with PKK internally. So Turkey portrayed PKK as a terrorist organization that was seeking to dismember the country, and everyone who was supporting PKK, was seen as supporting PKK, was working against Turkey's national interests. In 1999, what happened was Greece became involved because of the way a small group of people in the security apparatus of Greece worked independently of the government and tried actually to support Öcalan, became embroiled in the efforts of Öcalan, yes, to find a refuge. So Öcalan is arrested in Nairobi, leaving the house of the Greek ambassador, and is causing an uproar in Turkey against Greece. Now, became very emotional at the time. The accusations were that Greece was supporting the head of PKK was the main problem for Turkey. So relations are very bad at the time when the decision is taken to launch the NATO military intervention. That was something that the Americans were aware of. Also, 3 years earlier, in 1996, there was a major crisis between Greece and Turkey relating some rocky islands in the Aegean when there was a mobilization of Greek and Turkish military forces. The two countries came close to a military confrontation and the Americans stopped it. So we have relations between Athens and Ankara who are not particularly good. Probably what Clinton said was that in a very fragile situation where we have already existing problems, it's better to do something because might something happen. No, I'm not sure, if a regional war could erupt. For example, if North Macedonia could get involved or Bulgaria could get involved in a confrontation at the time because they were lacking the military resources, that is clear. Or even Albania at this point. But certainly, I think the fear for Clinton was more what could happen, in relation to Greece and Turkey at the time. So this is what happened. Now, Kosovo, Christian, I think you asked about Kosovo. Now, Kosovo is, as you know, an issue where Athens is among the 5 non-recognizers of the European Union, of Kosovo independence. Now, the Greek position in principle hasn't changed against recognition, but in practice, its policy towards Kosovo has changed because we have political contacts between the two governments, and we have seen Athens trying in the last few years to expand relations with Kosovo at every possible level. Okay, facilitating, for example, visas for Albanians from Kosovo coming to Greece, encouraging contacts, ties, etc., etc. I must say, my impression is that relations between the Kosovo government and the Greek government are probably more functional, more easier than relations between the Greek government and the Albanian government. It's very interesting because you don't have that backlog of issues between Athens and Tirana, Athens and Pristina, as you have between Athens and Tirana. Okay, but now the idea of recognizing Kosovo has gained ground even among decision makers. It's clear. Okay, when in private, I think when they discuss in private, most of the decision makers here in Greece would agree that we have to recognize Kosovo and will be a major contribution for stability in the region. But what I think stops them is mainly Cyprus. Although the resolution by the International Court of Hague in 2010 said that this is a sui generis case, Kosovo, and should not be used as a precedent for other cases. I also mentioned by name Cyprus. Nevertheless, here there is a concern that, it will encourage recognitions of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. So they prefer somehow to see first a resolution between Belgrade and Pristina, normalization, and then to follow. But as I said, my understanding is that in decision-making circles, the idea has matured that Athens should recognize the Kosovo. Okay, and this is a positive decision for the stability in the region. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all your answers, and they are really important and a great contribution to our knowledge. And I don't know, Valeria, I would like to ask Valeria.
No, just to say thank you again, and yeah, we shall be in touch, hopefully.
Thank you.
Definitely with the video information. Thanks everyone who participated. Thank you, Christian, for hosting us. Yeah, we do live in interesting times in many ways. So yeah, thank you for the session. I don't have anything further.
Few words on my part. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure talking to you, discussing with you, and I hope we can have another opportunity, maybe seeing other issues in the region which are important. I think a feeling that we all have is that we are going to work together or we die all together. I think the challenges are common, and for small societies, I think it's very important to work together. And this is, I think, the whole idea behind the European Union. It's better, power in unity than alone. I think this is very, very important to see that, materializing in all aspects, and hopefully seeing, the Western Balkans joining the European Union. I think this is the best thing anyone can hope for everyone. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Christidis, and thank you to all the participants. And it was a really great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.